This is the very last reporting category for world history up to 1500. And for this reporting category 6, we're focusing on civics and economics. There's civics and economics pretty much in every single standard, so we're going to go through them and kind of focus in on the different government and economic pieces that you need to know. So in the very early civilizations, looking at ancient river valleys and the other early civilizations, most of these civilizations are going to be led by hereditary rulers, like dynasties. The pharaohs were also included in this, and these essentially are rulers that are passing their power from family member to family member. In addition, a lot of these societies had really, really rigid class systems where slavery was accepted. Think about like the caste system, for example. In this area, the world's very first city-states and kingdoms and empires started to emerge. Those are the political kind of breakdown of how these different areas were organized. They started to develop a centralized government that's based on religious authority. For example, the pharaohs were thought of as gods. You also have the mandate of heaven from the Chinese that kind of establishes that these rulers were picked by God. There's also written law codes that start to emerge during this time, the very, very first of these being the Code of Hammurabi with Babylonians and the Ten Commandments from the Hebrews. Economically, we start to switch from this time period from being hunters and gatherers to starting to develop agriculture, and that leads to an agricultural surplus as during the Neolithic era, they start to develop better tools from metal, plows, and irrigation systems that help to make agriculture better. As people are having a surplus in agriculture, they no longer need to all be farmers. So you start to see a shift here from everybody being farmers to a specialization of labor, which leads to people doing things like becoming priests or merchants or scribes or things like that. There's also increased trade along the rivers and the seas. Specifically, the Phoenicians are going to be traveling along the Mediterranean, trading with different colonies that they set up in the Mediterranean Sea. You also have the development of slavery and first cities. That kind of helps with facilitate trade. Cities are going to be the first places where people begin trade, and slavery really helps to develop some of the economic systems around the world with that free labor, as unfortunate as it was. In Greece, again, we're talking here specifically about the government system. Greece eventually is going to develop a representative democracy, okay, or a direct democracy, where they had a monarchy before, then they had an aristocracy, then they had tyranny, and then they eventually come up to a direct democracy. In this democracy, citizens who were free adult males had political rights and the responsibility of participation in government. These were kind of things like voting in any sort of direct democracy, democratic type of functions in the middle of the city, participating in public debates and paying taxes and being a part of the government. During the tyranny phase of Athens, there were tyrants who were trying to work for reform like Solon and Draco, but eventually they lead to a direct democracy. That's in Athens. In Sparta, you have an oligarchy type of government, which is ruled by a small group of people. They also have a very rigid social structure with slaves at the bottoms that were called helots, and they're very militaristic. They even had little boys training to be in the military from like the age of 5 onward. In ancient Rome, they had a very specific social class setup. Patricians were at the very top. They were wealthy landowners. It's also the smallest group, but they're going to be the most powerful in Roman government as well. This next group you have is the plebeians. It was the majority of the population, the commoners. At the very bottom, you had slaves that were not based on race, but instead were gained when they conquested certain areas. The government was set up by patricians and plebeians being citizens. Citizens had certain responsibilities and rights, such as the right to vote. Selected foreigners could become citizens. Most of them could not vote, however. And many of the responsibilities were things like paying taxes and being a part of the military. Roman democracy, you can remember because it's Roman with an R, representative democracy with an R. They had broke up into 3 different government categories. You had assemblies, the Senate, and consuls that kind of broke up into these different parts here. The assemblies were the people that started to kind of create the laws, and they really interpreted the laws. The Senate also helped create the laws, and the consuls at the top were kind of like the executive branch. Rome's law was called the 12 Tables, also known as 12 Tablets. It just kind of depends on the way you look at it. In the Pax Romana, this occurs during the Roman Empire, during the rule of Augustus Caesar. The Pax Romana was a centuries of peace and prosperity. It also led to the expansion of the Roman Empire all the way from like Great Britain to India. Then during this time period, they had a lot of things that they were doing to create peace. Number one, they created a uniform system of money that helped to expand trade because now everybody in this empire was able to use the same form of money. They also made sure that the roads were safe to travel on. And when the roads are safe, it's going to be easier to trade. And these two things promote prosperity and stability. Stability kind of occurs when you have any standardization of anything, and prosperity occurs when trade is going well. Socially, during the Pax Romana, there is a stability to the social classes that Rome had been missing since before the civil wars. It also increases emphasis on the family. Politically, they created a civil service system where your job was based on the certain ability that you had, and they developed the uniform code of laws that created that stability that was necessary for Rome during this time. In the Middle Ages, you have feudal society economically broken into these pieces, right? So at the very top, you had a vassal. That vassals might be a king, it might be a lord, it might be a knight. All it means is it's someone who is receiving a fief. And a fief is a piece of land that's given to a vassal. On this land, the vassals might be given to them as a political favor. It might be given to them because they're a knight that has pledged to protect the other vassals. It just kind of depends. Most fiefs have their own serfs that work the land, and those serfs were obligated to work the land pretty much their whole life and weren't allowed off of the manor. During this manor system, there is a really rigid class structure. If you were a serf, you were always going to be a serf. And the manors became self-sufficient because of the fact that there was so many invasions in Europe going on at this time period. They were protected by the knights, and they were able to produce pretty much everything that they needed. Trade routes that start to emerge kind of in this medieval age and even before that, the trans-Saharan trade route, you have the maritime trade routes and the Silk Road. Gold and salt travel along the trans-Saharan trade route. You have spices and textiles and porcelain that come along the Silk Road. Spices are also traveling on the maritime trade routes through the Indian Ocean. Technology travels via these trade routes as well, like paper, crops, windmills, water mills, compasses, astrolabes, and then also ideas are traveling on these trade routes. So like religion, like Buddhism and Islam, and then other ideas like printing and paper money. During the late Middle Ages, kingdoms begin to unite under monarchs and adopt a national identity. This leads to the development of nation-states such as England, France, Spain, and Russia. England is going to advance the furthest governmentally because they establish a common law and also the Magna Carta, which limits the power of the king and gives power back to the people through Parliament. Overall, the Crusades has a major impact on the economy of Europe because of the demand that increases for Middle Eastern products. They begin to produce their own goods that would be popular in Middle Eastern markets, and they encourage the use of credit and banking, which expands trade and allows for those merchants to start their own businesses. Also important during this time period, credit is also increased because of the rule of usury, which outlaws high interest rates on loans. So it's going to be very easy for these people to get a loan to start their business. They also have letters of credit that are set up through the banks, and the banks start to use Arabic numerals as a way to keep track of their records. Originally, these Renaissance city-states had been independent. However, because of their location on the Mediterranean, it was easy for them to trade with many of these other areas that they would need access to. And they also became trading centers for the distribution of goods to Northern Europe. There was a lot of trade going through Italy, which is what helped to spur on the Renaissance. Another governmental ideology from this time period is the prince. Machiavelli wrote The Prince, emphasizing the absolute power of the monarch. He said that monarchs should do anything they have to do in order to keep power. The ends justify the means. And they should do good when possible, but evil when necessary. Thanks for joining me for this RFC video. Make sure that you take the quiz. It's listed below in the description. And I hope that your SOL goes well. Good luck.